Hey everybody, welcome. Episode 41. I'm Ken Pooch Van Druten, and
This is Chris Rabold. In 2021, I'm still Chris Rabold.
Can you believe it? 2021, episode number 41. That's 41 hours of fun with you and me.
How about 2021, episode 1 of 2021? Can you believe what a banger this has been?
I know. I feel a little bit bad for our listeners that we haven't put out something in a while, but it's just been crazy. I mean, you know, with the holidays and just everything that's going on in our lives, and people storming the Capitol building. Not that that's an excuse, but yeah, it's been a while, but we're back. We're back. We're doing an episode. We're back. We're up and running, and we're trying to put out some content for you guys. But in the meantime, Chris and I have been working really hard on a bunch of other stuff, like trying to come up with some things for the future. So look for those. 2021, we think, is going to be a great year and a good bunch of learning opportunities for everybody out there that we're going to be a part of. So stay tuned. That's about all I can say about that.
Please do.
Yeah.
Please do. Yeah.
But welcome, and hopefully 2021 is better than the dumpster fire that was 2020. Yeah, so let's talk about audio, because through all this other stuff that's happening on the planet right now, that's all a disaster.
Yeah.
This is reason we do this is to get away from all of that and to talk a little bit about audio. So.
Totally. I got to tell you a thought I had. Was thinking this last night. You know, there's this part of me, and I know all of us have gone through our own ups and downs, whatever it looks like during this time of like hopefulness and despair and blah 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 blah. But then there's this underlying, God, I can't wait to get back to it.
Yeah. And
I started thinking last night, I'm like, we're all looking at it through such rose-colored glasses that I forget how goddamn hard it is.
Oh, like, man.
You know what I'm saying? Like, live sound is hard. It's so difficult, depending on where you are. But I just envision the real startup, like once we're really doing it again, and you're so pumped, and input one, kick drum in the house, and it's the worst sounding room you've ever been in. And you're like, oh, right, I forgot this sucks, but like, I so welcome that as a problem to have in my life.
Oh,
I can't wait.
Me too. I've thought a lot about it. It is, this is the longest period. I'm doing projects at home, right? I'm doing some mixed projects. And so I'm getting to do some audio, but I'm mixing in the box. I'm not in front of an SC7. It's like literally the longest period that I've been away from my console. And I'm like, it kind of gives me a little bit of anxiety, because I'm like, when I, am working and there is like a month where I'm at home and then I go back to work, I go, oh man, am I going to remember how to do this?
Totally.
Well, it's been like 10 months, since I've been in front of a console. And so
it's staggering to think about the amount of time that's passed, and it's going to continue to pass.
I know. It's crazy. I am so looking forward to the next time that I can get in front of a live sound console and dig into it. But I'm sure I'm hoping that's not going to be under a super high pressure situation.
I know. The good thing is literally everyone will be in the same boat. Yeah. So there's something to be said for that. Performers as well.
I think so. I mean, luckily, the church community, you guys are still getting to work and being in front of consoles and stuff. So good for you. But I think there's going to be a great deal of us that are going to come back to this and be like, what am I doing?
Right. And the speed is what's going to suffer at the beginning, just the intuitiveness of it. But I do think we'll find the whole riding a bike adage will prove true as well. Like,
and I really think, let me shout this out to you guys. I know there's a bunch of you. I've spoken to a bunch of my previous system engineers, 2 guys that I know that are badass system engineers. and one of them has abandoned the business. He's done. He's going to go work. He started another business. He's, he literally sent me an email that was like, thanks, man. It was great working with you. I'm starting my own business. And then there's another dude who's like working at UPS right now. And, he's doing whatever it takes to get through it. But I'm hoping that those people like come back,
Yeah, totally.
There's excitement in coming back, because those two guys, man, if I lose those two guys, they're fantastic at what they do. So I'm hoping that happens. Well, enough of the grimness.
Yes.
Let's hope that 2021 is we get to work soon, and when we do, it's going to be awesome. What do you want to talk about? I thought today maybe we talk a little bit about, lately I've been doing some mix projects, stuff here at the house, and people have been sending me tracks, and I've been mixing songs. And I got to tell you, some of the tracks I've been receiving are just, live instruments, like live drums that were recorded that are just.
Is this from a live performance?
No.
Oh, okay. Even in the studio bad, huh?
Studio stuff.
Yeah.
Literally like a snare drum that sounds like someone was banging on a 55-gallon drum. And what it made me think about was, in the context of live sound, maybe we can talk a little bit about, if you remember, I don't know if I'm going to remember, but what it is that we do when we come across things that are just not great, like a $200 garage sale drum kit that the drummer has no idea how to tune. Like, what are some of the tricks and stuff that you and I do to get around that? Obviously a source is king, right? Like, if the source sucks, it's really hard to get something to sound good. But I think the reality of it is I think there's a lot of people out there that show up to a church service on Sunday, for example, where the drum kit is just horrendous sounding. I know that you and I have been in those situations, and what are some of the things that we do? So I don't know. You want to start us off? What happens when you show up and the drum kit sounds horrible? The kick drum sounds like a basketball, or
sure. When you mentioned this topic to me, I thought you were mixing live tracks.
No. Yeah.
From right. So this is in the studio. There's even less of an excuse to suck there.
I think we should apply it to the live thing, because that's what everybody's wanting to know.
Yeah.
But those two lines are so intermixed these days, studio and live. It's it's pretty much the same thing. But I've noticed that recently. I've been getting some tracks, and it made me think about the times when I was doing something live and showed up, and whatever input it was sounded horrible.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I dig this topic because I've been thinking about it. I was listening to a live album, or I was listening to just my phone was on random, and there's some live stuff came on, and it was and I'm listening to it, and I'm just like, I know that sound. And I'm like, I know that sound. I know everything the engineer's doing to pull out what they're pulling out of that.
Yes.
Which is still not so great. And it was making me think about what it is about live sound, where a lot of times that even despite our best efforts, there's just an inherent less than sound a lot of times that comes off of the stage. And it has to do with a number of factors. It has to do with, of course, even the greatest high-end consoles out there now, that you and I might use, those preamps aren't on par with some of the really fun, really cool, colored, really exciting stuff you can get. They're just not. Yeah. They're not. And they don't produce the same excitement. They don't produce the same pre-EQ'd kind of polished sound that a lot of times that you can get in the studio. But yet, here you are telling me, hey, no, I got stuff from the studio and it still sounds like shit. So I guess what I was thinking was, in live sound, we are so accustomed to dealing with not that great sounds. And it's not just the guys that are mixing Again, I realize there are no clubs now, but just to say there are, it's not just the people doing festivals or clubs or regional stuff where they're mixing 4 different bands a night they've never heard. I encounter it all the time. And I've had, I find it with a lot of times you mentioned drums, you've got some really great drum kit or really good enough drum kit with a drum tech who's a buddy who's really just there to high five the drummer and set shit up every day, and it doesn't sound good. And you try and you try and you try and you try, and it just doesn't sound great. And so I feel like as live sound engineers, we're used to less than awesome sources.
For sure.
Just pulling out the absolute best that we can. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. 100%. What are some of the things that you do? Like for instance, I got just because these are things that I've been doing recently, but I got these tracks and literally like I took a kick drum and like did unbelievable extreme EQ stuff, like 63 super wide Q to 12. And then also put like waves low air on it to try to make some beef in the bottom of it. And even at that, the track that was there, I still was like,
you weren't happy. You weren't totally stoked with it. I think it's just what you said. You commit to being as aggressive as you need to be. And sitting at home is one thing, but if it's like a throw and go, like you really don't have time to debate how insane that EQ is. I mean, I did the same thing. I had a project in October that I mixed, and the bass drum, for example, there's no bass in it. There was no bass to be found. And the way that I made it work was an insane amount of low end, a subharmonic synth. I used the Brainworks BX sub synth to where it didn't sound sub synthy, but it had sub content, and it's also funny you brought this up. A buddy of mine called me last night. He's a studio guy, and he usually he doesn't mix in the box very much, which I realize is rare these days, but there's a studio here in town with a vintage console, lots of killer gear, and they use minimal plugins. And he's in the box, and he's just like, man, this sucks. What do you do? And I went and opened up a session, and I looked, and for instance, on the snare drum, which sounded okay, I had Decapitator on there to kind of give it some grit and some life. And then I had an SSL channel that I know I went aggressive on. And then I had an API after that to do the top end that the API does. And like, that sounds stupid, but I promise it worked. And it's just, and if you don't have all that, if you don't have all the plugins, you're just doing onboard or whatever, then that looks like plus 14, but like, it looks stupid,
I mean, okay, so, we've said this a bunch of times. It's like, don't look, listen, do whatever it takes. But I'm telling you that there are times where doing whatever it takes, someone looking over my shoulder would go, what is happening? Like, literally, I've had situations where I have duplicated a channel like 4 times in a row. And each one of those individual channels, let's say on a snare drum, has some weird plugin doing a weird thing. Like using Decapitator to, get that crunch of the crack of the snare drum. If you listen to that channel by itself, it's the most horrendous sounding thing in the world. But if you combine it with another channel that has 20 dB of boost of 200 in it, and then another channel that has, a bunch of like SSL channel compression, and you put all 4 of those channels together,
you get something usable.
You end up with something that sounds like a snare drum, and those are the type of extreme things that I'm talking about, and that I go there sometime, it's not often, because luckily, I'm kind of working for clients that hopefully the source is pretty good. But man, I tell you, about like once or twice a year, if you were to look at the file, you would just go, what was happening?
I've done I have some tricks. If it's just like, if I get a kit this happens often, with drums. Drums and guitars are the two that and now I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, okay, but I always have those clacky basses and I always have, so it's good. We'll just go through them. But
just go through it.
I think about with snare drums, I want, aside from just me wanting, I wish all snare drums were, 6.5-inch black beauties with the cool bottom, but they're not. So how do I do the best I can with what I'm given? And sometimes I have to stop myself from making it something that it's not, if that makes sense. I have to be like, no, like, don't make, it's not a black beauty. Don't make it one. It's never going to do that. But like, I so know the sound of 220 hertz boosted on a snare when it's really not there. It's just the closest, you know what I mean? It's just like the closest thing you can find to low end. And so then what you're boosting, and I think this is what I heard on that live album that I just randomly played in my car the other day too, is you end up mixing. It's passable. In fact, it can end up being good, but it's not. I'm boosting proximity effect. Yeah. I'm boosting microphone sound. I'm not even boosting tonality of that drum. You know what I mean? Or I might even be boosting into the top end of a snare drum, wanting to catch hat in it to give it that thing. I remember one time I started doing this thing where, a lot of times people tune their live snares really tight. They want it responsive. They want it to pop back and it just kills the tone. And I started doing this thing with like multi-band compression and I called it my like virtual wallet. Whereas in the studio, you could, the whole tape a wallet to a drum trick to deaden it, where there was this, instead of a static EQ, it just worked better to have like a multi-band section, not really, like just above the low mids in the mid range to take out the that shit. And it's like, why am I doing that? I shouldn't have to do that. But that's what, and then it became a thing where I kind of dug it. So I started trying to use it all the time. And I found that it didn't work well on a well-tuned snare drum. It didn't work well, but on just a mess of a snare drum, that was a tactic. That's something that I employ to really deal with the overly ringy, overly tightened snare.
So you were using dynamic EQ specifically in a frequency range that was squashing just one little bit of the snare.
And I haven't had to do it. I haven't had to do it in years, but it's one of those things that's in my back pocket. I'm like, okay, if I get a too tight snare drum, forget what size it is, forget what kind of drum, for whatever reason, of course I had a static EQ on it as well, but that was something that I found deadened it. And just it made a difference. And in fact, I remember being at center staging one time and went into a really well-known engineer who we didn't really know each other very well, but I went into his room and he was doing the same thing. And he was like, and I was like, right on, man, and he was doing it too in a damage control way. He didn't want to be doing it.
Sure.
So it's just, one of those things that I'm thinking that's an example of something I keep in my back pocket. I got a bunch of them now that I'm starting to think about it.
Well, good. Yeah. And we'll get to them for sure. My go-to, it's weird. It's like my picture of what a snare drum should sound like probably includes a lot more 200 than maybe what most people tune their drums to have. Like I come from a place, I grew up in the 80s. And so, that 80s snare drum that has all that thud part of it is often not what people are tuning their drums to sound like. So sometimes I manufacture that because that's the sound that I want. You know what I mean? It's maybe not the sound that's coming out of that snare drum. And I don't know if that's good or not, but somehow it makes it work in the mix for me. And the tool I use a lot is a plugin by Waves called Torque. And that I use that on kick drums and snare drums a lot because it helps to manufacture a tone that doesn't really exist. So I've had a lot of success since.
Is that the one that does, you give it like a frequency range and it almost does like is there like a transient designer element to it?
Kind of, yeah. But it's basically, it's more like, it's like,
I know I've seen a demo
for a drum. You can actually focus energy in the low end part of the actual, snare drum, for instance, and find a frequency, of that it will help to enhance, kind of transient designer-ish.
But frequency specific.
But whatever it's doing, it's not doing what you described earlier, which is what I hate when you're overemphasizing with EQ,
what's not there,
effect and air and stuff that isn't there really.
Right.
This plugin, I think, is designed to actually create the tone along the similar lines of like low air, where you're creating something that doesn't exist. And it, I've had a lot of success with that particular plugin. Even on already great sounding snare drums, I'll use that as a tool to kind of overemphasize the real meat of a snare drum. So I've had some success with that.
It's interesting that that multi-band carve the mid-range thing. While I say I don't use it unless I need to on snares, I've made it something I do as a starting point on a toms group.
Oh, cool.
For some reason, because it just, you do the individual toms, or at least I do the individual toms. Then I go into the group and I shape the group a little further. And then I'll have that multi-band thing there that just chooses. It really does help level out the tonality of all of them, because on, of course, on one drum, it might only do this. On the next drum, it might do that. It's
correct.
Ideally, you get it at the source, but it's a good evener. So while I don't employ it all the time on snares, I do keep it active. Sometimes if the toms just sound great, I don't need it, but I tend to start with it on.
Yeah. How about non-mechanical issues like a horrible sounding line, for instance, that has, let's take a guitar or a bass, for example. I can't tell you how many times, even on the current artist that I'm working on, right now, Iron Maiden, amazing sounding inputs coming at me, but the idol of all of those old school amps and all of that old school stuff that's sitting there is, literally, like if no one was playing and we were in a quiet arena, it's pretty drastic what's happening there. Just, so right. I end up doing like a bunch of soft gating, so that, in between songs and, lower volume sections of, songs, trying to eliminate noise, and that's literally me spending hours trying to actually go to the source and fix the source. And it's just not possible because they're amps from the 70s and the 60s. And they make noise. They have a noise floor on them that's making noise.
Right.
The instruments that they have. So do you have any tips or tricks about that? What about basses and guitars? And
yeah, it's funny. One tip I have is to cut myself a little bit of slack and learn what is like in rock and roll, for example, what is the acceptable noise floor of rock and roll? Because to a degree, hey man, that's just the sound of like shit's about to go down. That's okay. And I've also, the same thing holds true with like rattly snare bottoms. Sometimes the sound of those between vibrating is like, as I've gotten older, I'm like, no, that's kind of cool.
It's kind of a thing.
Yeah. I'll embrace it. So, but yes, gosh, with noisy, particularly if like the player knows it's that noisy, the tech knows everyone knows it's that noisy, they don't realize maybe that it's that noisy, but when it's coming through that PA, it's a whole other level of noisy. Like
not only that, but like 56 inputs of noisy,
right?
Like the math of that, the addition of that is not something that each tech has to deal with. Nope. You're the one that has to deal with the multiplication of all of that.
And that's right. And I always tell guys, like when we get into a conversation or God forbid an argument, I'm just like, look, I'm the sieve. All of it comes to me. Yeah. So like you're
the funnel. You're the funnel.
We're the funnel. And so like the little like, nah, it's okay over here. Like you just said, multiplied times whatever is not okay. So please help me get there. But yeah, a lot of soft gating on guitar amps, on basses, even basses for like, you know, a lot of times players don't realize where between songs, it's just going, it's buzzing, it's humming, it's that low, it's that. And you know how it is after time with experience, you no longer go, what is that? Because you think something's getting ready to feedback, you know, it's the bass. And once in a blue moon, you'll see the bass player put their, you know, mute the strings.
Yes.
And know to do it. So a lot of soft gating. And I think we talked about this on here, but if anybody's wondering what we're talking about, you know, you literally can do it with playback or in the moment. Just sit there. I tell you how I do it. I go to a gate and I set the attack where it's not going to be clicky. Yep. So past the fastest, but just slightly.
Slightly.
Just right. Still probably
so it opens quickly, but it doesn't have that snap that we talk about, you know, for toms and that kind of shit. Right. So just past that, the release at something low, whatever. And then I always have the hold at something low. I always have the release at around a second. Yeah.
So that's just my generic starting point. And just sit there, guys, and just go. And if that amp's going between songs, just take it and take it down until it stops.
Yeah.
And then you can find two, then you can be like, okay, that's where I'm starting now. But then make sure that a snare drum or a kick drum or something's not also going to open it. And this is when you end up with thresholds at like -43 or something, but they pay giant dividends because they do help to clean it up, especially between songs. So that's a big one. And also, you know, we did an episode not too long ago about high pass and low pass filtering too. You know, if I've got a bass that's really rizzy, I'll low pass that bass.
Yeah.
To get rid of it, you know, like no problem. Cause I don't need that stuff anyway.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. The clackety clack part of the super high clackety clack part of a bass is usually not something that's great. Let's talk about that. What about a bass guitar that doesn't sound great? You know, I mean, we've run into that.
Yep.
I mean, I've done some crazy expansion. Like for me, a C6 is like a super great tool for a horrible sounding bass guitar. And I have set up a C6 that just looks crazy, like weird expansion in the bottom and a bunch of compression to get rid of the clackety clack, but it's got this expansion at 100 so that when they play higher notes. My biggest complaint, you know, I'm a bass player. I grew up, you know, playing bass, went to Berkeley and played bass. And my biggest complaint about bass players is notes on the neck showing up as different volumes in their output. So as they play higher up on the neck, you know, those notes start disappearing. They're not coming out like the rest of the stuff. And then they dig into a low B, for instance.
The worst. The most just, amateur sound
socks off
in audio to me.
Yeah. So that is it's a playing thing, but it's also an equipment thing. You know, bass players that haven't spent a bunch of time like working that out and getting that right. It drives me crazy, but I run into that a lot as a sound guy. So how do you fix that? What are some things that you do to fix that?
Right. I do a lot. It's rare. Again, throw and go, one channel of bass DI, and I'm doing what I can with whatever tools I have. Yeah. But even with a really good bass player, here's another one. Even with a really good bass player, but because of the nature of the show, they're moving all the time. That can take the most consistent player with the most well-balanced instrument and easily throw it out of whack. And it's really not their fault. They're running. You know what I mean? One thing I almost always do now, it's funny, we talked about not too long ago, we talked about something about similar to this. And I mentioned, you know, that the low B, or the low, whatever it is, being out of whack. And you're like, no, any note being out of whack. Yes. And that stuck with me. I'm like, yeah, he's right. But one thing I'll almost always do is more times than not now, there is some sort of multi-band, and it is a multi-band, not a dynamic EQ, a multi-band. And I just
compression.
Yeah. I define where I'm thinking low end is. Yeah. Like with this person, does it need to be 80 and below, or are we talking 160 and below? And it's always there as a fail safe. And with some people, it's just only to cut. Other people, it is truly to even. It does the cut, but then it has the boost built in. A lot of times for me, though, like you would be inclined to look at what I'm doing at the start of the chain and be like, well, aren't you thinning it out? Well, I might be ducking it with the C6 or the whatever it might be, and then making it up somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that's almost always in play now, particularly if I don't know the player. I'm just expecting there to be some unevenness.
Do you find yourself using expansion? In general, when we're talking about all of the channels across the console, you would most likely find expansion in my channels on the bass. Is that like something that you utilize? Or yeah.
That's like the only place I do it. I've never, because what I'll do is I'll sit there. I was thinking about on a tour that I do, I just ended up with this really great bass sound. He's a great bass player, but it involved expansion around, I'm going back to this frequency range again. It was higher. It was more like, it was somewhere between 250 and 300.
Yep.
There was expansion in there, and it was a 5 dB boost with the ability to similarly compress that. And there would be times when I would look at it and I'd be going, well, it looks like it's boosting 5 and always compressing 3. Why don't I just turn it up 2 and lose this? But it didn't sound the same.
Yeah.
And bass is the only place that I really ever do that. I've just never really gotten into a lot of expansion.
Yeah.
I've seen some creative uses. Actually, during COVID, I've noticed some interesting things guys are doing on drums, on snare drums, to keep hi-hat bleed out to like basically the expansion occurs only when the drum is hit, so they can leave their snare top ungated. And so the hi-hat's coming through it, but it's not coming through it with the plus 20 until it's hit, which I'm that's witty. I don't care to do that because I've been fine for 25 years not doing that, but I get why they do it. So yeah, bass is kind of the only place that I do it. And I really only do it in the low mid. And that's really where I'm just looking for notes.
Yeah. What I find with the bass guitar a lot is that the E string and a B string if it's a 5 string, but the E string has all that information, that 200 to 400 range. Even as you play upwards on the E string or the B string, when you're playing on the E string and you're in the middle of the neck, it still has all that information. But on the A string and the D string, it doesn't have that information. So if you're playing the same note on the A string or the D string versus the E string, you could play the same note on those strings. It's just a different part of the neck. The 200 to 400 range of a bass guitar acts very differently in those different strings. And so I feel like I have to do expansion and compression in that range from 100 to 400, let's say, because as that person is really cranking down, bass players really cranking on an E string, playing a G on an E string and just cranking down on it, I need to squash that information. That 200 to 400 needs to get squashed. But then when they start nailing, the octave higher on the A string,
you want it filled out
to be expanded, and so I spend a bunch of time. There's some crazy looking C6 on my bass channel sometimes. Yeah, it's
there's something to be said too. I think a lot of times with bass players, like you said, if it's a B, if it's an E, whatever that lowest string is, there's freedom in that string as a player, because there's nothing above it. And there's literally physically nothing above it. So if anything can be sloppily played, it just happens to be the nuclear bomb of that instrument, which is the lowest of low end. So it's where they can get away with being the sloppiest, and it's where there's the most energy. And that's how that can go awry so quickly.
Have you found, there's been a couple of, and I won't tell you the bands, the big bands, huge bands, where I've literally had to turn the bass guitar into something that just makes low end information. Like I've taken, a low pass filter and just, squashed it all the way down, and emphasized information from 40 hertz to 80 hertz, let's say. And that is just information that I'm using to kind of make my whole mix have that information, but it's not really defined. Like notes are hard to pick out, you know, it's all it is making this low end pad, literally, because what's coming from the source is just kind of unusable. You know
it's
what I mean?
Not there.
It's like clickety clackety.
Yep.
And the notes that they're playing, anything above, you know, the first 4 frets of all the strings, like if they're playing anything up on the neck, are just like, oh my, like what's happening? And so I've literally had to take all that and like low pass to, you know, I don't know, something crazy like 400, you know, and just get rid of all that 1K, 2K, 3K stuff that is normally, you know, what makes a bass guitar have cut through your mix or whatever. But I've had to eliminate that because what's coming through is just like, oh, that's so nasty. And I think if any of those bands had heard the bass guitar by themselves, would have been like, what are you doing? Right. But in the scope of the picture of the mix, you know, it was something that I had to do. Have you had any situations where you've had just crazy stuff happen with bass guitar?
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, I was working on something I was going to do this year too, and I've seen people do it. You got to be careful when you start employing what are essentially crossover filters, because as you then manipulate, if you take a source, let's make it simple, you double it.
Yeah.
But you cross it over using the same type filter at the same type space. Once you then start manipulating one of those two channels, phase wise, things can get weird, and then it gets crazy at the crossover point, and it's just all what the fuck just happened. But I was really working on just that, like treating my bass. Usually what I'll do is I'll have the bass channel, and then I'll have, and I've mentioned this on here before, where I'll have like kind of parallel channels doing various things, and one of them is usually a distorted channel. But it's a lot of times I'll distort in the middle, because there's all the clickety clack, and I want to fill in this. So what it becomes is like a honk, sort of. It's this mid-range. It's just a tone thing that you use. But I was experimenting with taking the bass, separating it into, you basically, again, 2 separate channels with a crossover point. I can't remember what on this particular person, what I had settled on as that crossover point, and then using different compressors, different compressor types on the different ones to emphasize and to basically to fabricate the tone that wasn't there.
Yeah, that's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking, you know what, my go-to really is, if there's an input that's horrible, my go-to is to duplicate it and then kind of create a broken version of it.
Fuck it up.
Sums all together again. And that's true of anything, of snare drums, of kick drums, of bass guitar, of guitar. I think that is my go-to. You know, when an input sounds horrible, my go-to is let's make 4 of it.
Right.
And try to, you know, emphasize certain parts that then you resum together. I mean, but you have to be super careful about that. You're absolutely right. As soon as you start doing that, as soon as you duplicate something, you start ripping things apart and using a single channel for individual parts of that instrument, then phase is the real problem, right? You know, putting that all back together.
It is. Like, I love, I still travel with, I don't like the one that I have so much these days, but I still travel with like a real Sans amp when I can. And I used to use the old one with the wall wart, like the one from, I guess it was the late 80s or the 90s. Can't remember what happened to that one. And then I got the newer one that has like the digital readout. It just doesn't sound the same, but I loved the Bomb Factory plugin. That still exists. That thing's great. I just don't work on any platforms where I can use it anymore. You know, but it's like, as soon as you employ that on a channel, check the phase. And the thing about that, though, you know, don't expect to find perfect cancellation or summation. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. What are you wanting it to do? You know, but I would say if there's any input that gets, unless it's just a phenomenal player that gets a lot of
attention.
Yes, it's the bass, and shaping it into something it's not. Because, you know, when you were mentioning, sometimes you end up with this big low endy sort of, you just want to create that pad for everything to sit on. I've also had the situations where the player was actually really good, and there was so much beautiful stuff going on. from, 100 to 400, all those notes and everything, but the arrangement was just eaten up with it elsewhere. And I can't do it. So I'm begrudgingly having to actually dig out there, and then go down and look and find like a 50 hertz bump and, maybe nothing else on top, or maybe that classic 1K. People always want to go to like 1K on basses to make it do something, I've had to do that too, to where the bass was really good, but the arrangement couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
I
think you pointed something out there that is a go-to for me. The number one tool for me on bass guitar is harmonic distortion. So whatever that means, whatever tools that you're using to create harmonic distortion, something about adding harmonic distortion to bass inputs makes it the glue that locks in with drum kit stuff. So I tend to, along with doing some weird expansion stuff that's pretty common on a bass guitar for me, I too do, what you were talking about, Bomb Factory, Sanzam stuff. Lately I've been using, there's a Waves plug called Sapphire that does odd and even harmonic things. And I'll duplicate the bass channel and put that on there to replicate harmonic distortion. And if you were to listen to that channel by itself, it would be pretty abrasive.
Right.
But combining with the overall nicely squashed and expanded version of the bass guitar, those two things really make the high end part of the bass sing without getting clacky.
Yeah.
So those are, listen, for me, I had a professor at Berkeley that explained mixing as, I think I've told you this before, but like as a plant, right? And that drums and bass guitar are the roots of this plant. And you can't have the rest of the plant, can't have leaves and flowers and all the other shit
right.
without the roots and the roots of the plant. So the bass guitar and the drums locked in is the only way that the rest of the stuff in your mix is going to work.
Right.
So I spend a great deal of time making sure that there's glue, for lack of a better term, between the bass guitar and the drums. And if I can't make that happen, like the rest of the mix doesn't work for me. That's always the case. If I can't make those things work together, so I spend a great deal of time on bass guitar. As you, I think.
Yeah. And you can't get that cool kick drum sound that we all want with a not good bass guitar.
True.
Because then your kick drum sticks out and sounds, whatever, hokey, and just it's no fun, so doing whatever you have to do on bass, oftentimes multing it. Again, that's the beauty of the digital era. If you can do it, is you just make copies and
gate the channel, in a way,
and then you're essentially making individual little tone controls in there. You're talking about tracks that are less than. I remember I mixed this live album one time, and the guitar, I'm not kidding you. It sounded like they mic'd, it was a 212, half stack or whatever that would be. It sounded like they mic'd the handle. Like it was just all woof. And it was all, I'm just like, did anyone listen to this thing?
Wow.
What is this sound that I'm hearing, And that was an example of, you get to an input that's just so dark, and here we are again. You just start getting creative, you just start digging into whatever EQ you can get, and you cut out every last bit of bottom that you can, whatever you have to do to make it work. It just does make you wonder, like, did anyone listen, or was the simple fact that an input was active, was that like, we're good, let's go?
I saw a meter, it's working.
Which is the case a lot of the times.
It is, unfortunately, especially in the case of someone that's showing up just to record and isn't mixing it right then. Like, whoever's recording is not the front of house mixer. Let's say it's someone that showed up and just got a split.
Right.
A lot of times they don't even listen to the inputs. They just look and say, "Oh, there's a meter there, and it's working."
Yep. And it's very sign of the times now too, for things just in general to be tracked. And this is not true of everyone. That is completely unfair. However, there is a lot of, you can fix that, right? You can fix that, right? Whether it's the performance or the tone.
Yeah.
I tell you one thing, it's a good habit. I know a lot of bands that I've worked for have done this, is to make a habit of tracking. You're going to track a bass CI no matter what, but a lot of times, you know, people will track electric guitar DI'd as well, in case, so they can reamp it later.
Oh, yeah.
If they know they're going to do that, or reamp it in the moment. I mean, I did that back in the day. I had and it went horribly wrong several times. I mean, I had a Line 6 rack unit out front. I've used emulators. I've done it all, and that's dangerous ground to get on. But having a DI track is worth it for either mixing it later or maybe fixing it when it's just not that great.
Yeah.
From the source.
I've said here before, you know, my secret weapon for all my rock guitars is that Palmer PDI-09. It's a speaker DI that gives you a really clean, great sounding DI'd guitar, because it's between the actual head and the speaker. And so it takes the speaker load through it. And so basically it gives you whatever the output of the head is. And alone, it's not that great by itself, but with that and a couple of microphones on some 412s, and you've got a real winning guitar, in my opinion.
Those things are killer too, because of where they come in the chain. So, you know, effects or boosts, like lead channel stuff happens. I did a live record once where I had to bring in the guys. Okay, the guitar track was it just sounded so bad. We had the time. The guitar tech was excellent, knew the act backwards and forwards, knew every song. I had him come in. We reamped with the DI, but the tech had to do all the had to do all the, like, the lead channel stuff, but he knew it so well that he could, and we just put a single 57 on it or something like that, and just it sounded amazing. It was so good, but you don't always have the luxury to do that. But that's what's cool about the Palmers, is they come at the end of the line, so they're going to get whatever came before. You're not going to miss anything, you know.
It can really screw you up though. Have you ever been in a situation? I worked for a couple of bands where, for whatever the reason is, whatever they're listening to on stage or whatever, when they kick in a lead, the volume goes down.
I was thinking about this today.
Instead of up.
That's a common problem, man. I feel like it drives me nuts. What was I listening to? I was listening to something today. I was driving around with my daughter listening to a song, and I had mixed it earlier this year, and I remembered the live version. If you're pushing a solo +8 or plus, something's fucked up, you know?
Something is wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. And I get it. Chords, just like that, the low string on bass is more energy. It's bigger. Single note stuff is less, but, like, don't you hear it go down? Don't you want it to come forward?
Well, I mean, and it's just as bad as the guy that's got the lead boost that's, 20 dB high, right?
Yes.
Like, I've worked for bands literally where, I know where the guitar solo is, and instead of boosting the solo, I'm cutting it by 10 dB, because what the guy is sending me is like, knock your,
here's a great point. This is, I mean, you know what? This might be the take home of the thing is communication with your fellow engineer. And what I mean by that is, I know that one act that I work with, I had a really hard time, because the way the monitor guy got through it all was everything was very low threshold, high ratio compression on everything. So and everybody was on ears. So these players were just constantly jacking their pedals or their patches. And so the monitor guy's digging it. He's happy because everything's even, but he's like, I'm being handed just a nightmare of a scenario.
Same things happen to me. Yeah.
Right. Level wise. And that really is at a certain point. It's like, hey man, I get it. Like, rehearsals were kind of hairy at the beginning, but everyone's shit is whack now, So that's a tough conversation. It can be a tough conversation to have, because you don't want it to be like, hey, do this, set your channels this way, but you do want it to have it known, like, hey, can we use as little processing as possible coming from the stage, so the guys actually know what's happening, particularly now when everything's in ISO boxes or no one's walking up to their amp. They're just hearing it through their ears.
That's right.
So yeah, that's a big one, is make sure that, monitor world is playing ball with you in a way that's helpful, you know.
And that's a hard conversation to have, but it is definitely a conversation that I've had, you know, with somebody saying, you know, listen, man, you're forcing these musicians to do things that are like, you know, it's dumb what's happening, and you're changing the tone of the guitar so much because the guy is turning it up so much to try to get rid of this brick wall compressor that you have going on there,
and probably doing something tonally to make up for the smothered sound as well. Yeah, that's a common problem, man. That's very common.
It's a hard thing, but you have to have those conversations because the musicians are just doing that because they don't know any better, you know. So you want the thing to sound great. The hardest situation, I've walked into that situation 2 or 3 times where a front of house guy has been fired and I show up to an already existing tour.
Yeah, and you know what's up.
And that's happening all over the place.
And you know it.
And you know it. And as you're trying to dial up your own stuff, you're like, I know what's wrong here. I know why the guy got fired.
Yep.
And so then that's a hard, you know, you got to show up and monitor the world and be like, hey, dude.
Yeah. And we haven't even talked about vocals. We haven't even talked about the vocals that are on Stun, and therefore everyone is singing.
They're doing this. Dude, I have had singers that are there. You can tell they're trying to get away from themselves.
Yes. Dude, I swear, Pooch, I feel like, I'm not lying, 70% of the acts I work with, I'm watching the people.
They're like,
I'm watching people scared.
I'm so loud.
Yeah, they're scared to go in.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is completely opposite of the way that a proper vocal microphone should work. You want them to, you know, eat that microphone, get that proximity effect, do all that.
Right.
And you as a monitor engineer are now forcing them to do this because they're so loud in their ears.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing. Listen, I'm not a monitor guy. I know how hard the job is. I was a monitor guy in the first part of my career, so I get it. You're just trying to survive. But at some point, there is a finesse part of that you can help yourself and me as a front of house guy by backing it out of their ears enough to force them to, you know, start.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's one. I understand how it happens. You know, it just takes one day of rehearsals of, and that's it. For the next 10 years, that's how loud the vocal is, because everyone, the monitor guy stays, you stay, the lyric, you know, you just, and you struggle and you struggle and you struggle. So that's the one place, you know, as we're kind of getting towards the end of inputs and fabricating things, duplicating bass channels is relative, unless it's super noisy, is relatively safe and easy because it's a direct source. You can do a lot to drums. You can do a lot to guitars. Vocals, it's almost like there's only so much you can do, because we're starting to talk about once we're getting into like expansion on vocals or doubling up.
It's the hottest input in your mix, right? So
yeah, it's already the hottest just inherently, and it's the loudest. You can't get away with as much there, or it's gonna feed back.
That's true.
You know, or it's gonna get really gnarly. So once you get to poorly either tracked vocal, if you're remixing, or just a poor vocal in the moment, that's the place where there are only so many tricks.
But you know, the greatest thing about vocals is that in every other case, right, you can't walk up to the drummer and you say, that snare drum sucks, here's a Black Beauty, right? Like that just doesn't happen. But in vocals, you can make the correct mic choice. If you're struggling and shit sucks, guess what? You get to be the guy that goes, hey, we're swapping this out, and we're going to use a Telefunken AM81 now, because whatever it wasn't working. You know, you get to choose the type of microphone that you're using on that person. And generally a vocalist doesn't give a shit, right? They're like, oh, okay, all right, thanks. You know, they'll try a new one. And so that is my go-to fix, rather than, you know, like guitars, you know, we end up with a horrible sounding snare drum. You just have to deal with it. You duplicate a bunch of channels, you get around it, you do the best that you can. With vocals, my go-to is if I hear a vocal that just sounds like shit right from the beginning, or it's the wrong microphone for that person, I automatically say, okay, we're going to swap you to X amount of vocal microphones. So I think it's important. It's one of the most important tools in your toolkit as a front of house engineer is to know vocal microphones enough to know the right choices for the right sounding vocalist, right? That's like an important toolkit to have.
The right sounding vocalist and what is their technique? Because so much of it has to do with where is that hand?
Yeah, that's right.
You know what I mean? Especially now. That's like, you know, I would love, if I honestly, I would probably, and not just to like be some sort of throwback purist minimalist, I would put a 58 up most of the time. A lot of the time, I'm down with the 58. It is. But once they start cupping it, it's the wrong choice.
That's right.
And that's when, like what you're saying, it gets into like, have it in mind. Okay, then what is a good choice? What does handle that well, you know?
Yeah, it's funny, you know, so most of the time when I have a vocal, you know, it isn't an electronic fix. It's like I'll mess around in rehearsals or whatever, or even if it's a one-off, you know, if I'm looking at on the stage and then looking at how that person sings. Are they this? Are they this singer when they sing loud? Do they get into it when they sing loud? Do they cup? Are they screaming into it, or are they holding it here and singing? All of those different variations of things lend well to different types of microphones, you know, cardioids and wide, super hypercardioid, supercardioid, all the different patterns make a difference in what's happening with a vocalist. And so having knowledge about, you know, the top 5, let's say, you know, vocal microphones that are out there and how they do well. Like you said, a 58 doesn't survive well when someone's cupping it. You know, there's a lot better microphones. You know, the DPA, whatever, vocal microphone doesn't have any proximity effect. So if you've got a vocalist that's doing a lot of this and then, you know, doing this kind of stuff, maybe you might want to eliminate proximity effect and choose that microphone, you know, to get rid of that. So my go-to is not, what I'm saying is my go-to is not to duplicate channels and not to go to a plugin or an electronic fix. My fix for vocals is very much a piece of gear change.
Go to the source. It just made me think about, remember in I guess it was the late 90s, when the early 2000s, when it was like, everybody's putting out the tightest hypercard that you can. Everybody. All the Audix
like
stuff.
You literally, if you had a singer that did this, like you wouldn't hear him.
You wouldn't hear it. And so at that time, you know, it's like, oh, I know how I'm going to clean up the stage. Look at all these super tight mics. But then you're finding, exactly, the guy that's doing this.
Dude, and
it's made it worse. It's made it worse.
Lightsaber of sound, too, when they point it at something. Like
yes.
If they point it at the drums, it's like, holy crap, it's fucking 20 dB of drums. You know?
Yep. So sometimes it's a leap of faith when you're trying to clean it up.
Yeah.
But it actually might be a wider mic that you need because the guy's 47 years old and not changing, and he's gonna sing from here.
That's right.
Let it be wider, like you know. But that's an experience kind of thing. So,
that's it, man.
At the end of the day, though, I mean, you just do your best with what you have.
You do your best. You know, we all run into situations where, you know, source is the king. And bottom line, the way to fix something is to go to the source and fix it, right? Like what we're talking about is putting a Band-Aid on the gusher, right?
Yeah.
When the guy's cut his arm off, and now I'm putting a Band-Aid on it to try to, you know, get through it and to, you know, to make it through. But really, the solution to all the things that we've talked about today are to go to the source in any way that you can, and have a conversation, you know, with the drummer, maybe in a nice way. There's ways to do it. Like, hey man, you know, I'm just not digging the snare drum. Is there another snare drum you have that we can try? Or try a different tuning? Those are the conversations that I have first before I go to I've got to make 4 channels of snare.
Right. I'll tell you, this is reminding me of a gig that I took over. This is one of the best sounding gigs I've ever done. This was somehow now, it's 5 years ago, I guess. But I inherited it. It was the guy that had it was God, and he was great and everything. And he left and he put his guy in place.
Yep.
And it all fell apart. Right. So then they brought me in, but there was only, the tour had been going on for like a year, and there was only, I don't know, 3 months left or something like that, you know? So I came in, and it was, if you could have picked my least favorite mics, that
this has happened to me too. Yeah,
every
100%.
single input was I hated every single one of them so much. But they love the monitor guy.
Yeah,
he had been doing a phenomenal job. They were also on the home stretch. They'd been out for a year. There were 3 months left.
Yeah,
it was not the move to come in there
to switch the microphone,
change everything. I didn't change one goddamn microphone, not one. And it sounded great. Yep. There was a good sounding show, and I didn't do it. And I remember it all the time. When I think about that show, I think about all those microphones up there that I dislike so much, you know, but that was where politically it was not the move.
It was the right thing to do. Yeah.
It was the right thing to do, to just roll with, and to be honest, the sources were fine.
Yeah.
But man, they could have been better, but that wasn't the move. That wasn't.
I've had that conversation. Like I have the same thing. You know, I've shown up, somebody got fired or left or whatever, and I show up and I talk to the monitor guy that's been there for 6 years, and he sends me the input list, and I look at the input list and go, oh,
right,
really?
Yeah.
Like, why do you have an SM81 on a hat?
Yeah.
Like, really? Come on, dude.
Right.
But then you call the dude up and you go, you know, that guy is that monitor engineer for the first day and a half that you've been hired is terrified that you're going to come in and change everything. 100%. They're sitting there going, shit.
Yes. Any minute now.
And just fuck my world up. You know?
Right.
And so I don't do that. You know, I won't do that. If I'm showing up somewhere and there's an established monitor mix that everybody's happy with, I'll go with whatever the choices are. But it just sucks because you know how much better it could be.
Right.
You know, and you make it happen, right? You do whatever you got to do, you know. But you know, you know, with some better choices that, wow, it could be better.
That's when you play the long game and you're like, all right, if we do this again, not for sure, but probably I'm going to change something. You know what I mean?
And those are, you know, as you get to know the monitor guy, you can make conversation like, hey man, have you ever tried such and such a microphone? Check it out, dude. You might like it. And then you can, you know, slowly mold it to be the way that you want. But, anyway, so that's dealing with not so great sources, and those are some things that Chris and I do to try to get around that. We realize that you know, a lot of you out there are run into situations where your sources suck, and you know, my recommendation for any of that is do whatever it takes. I mean, I'm serious. There are if you were to look at some of my files for some, you know, one-offs or whatever that I've done, you would wonder if I'd lost my mind, because the stuff that's happening there is just nuts. Yeah. And I'm just doing whatever it takes to make the end result be good. Because remember, the guy with the 40-ounce beer doesn't care what your EQ looks like.
Not at all. Nor has any patron ever asked to look at my.
That's right.
You know what I mean? No one's ever looked.
No one's ever. Only us nerdy engineers are looking at an EQ and going, "What are you doing?"
Totally.
But anyway, thanks for tuning in, guys. We appreciate you hanging with us when we haven't put out an episode in a while. We're gonna keep doing it.
Man, we're here.
Yeah, we got lots of stuff coming. You know, 2021 is going to be a really great year for Pooch and Rabold. So hang in with us.
Yeah.
Right.
And guys, and you know what, too, real quick, you know, all of it, it's funny right now. We're just like, we're listening, we're talking, we're reminiscing. Before you know it, it's going to be time to bone up. And I don't mean tomorrow, but there is going to be a time where it's time to go out and produce, you know? So
we've had a lot of feedback of guys telling us that they've gained some knowledge, and that's really that warms our heart, guys. We hope that you go back out. What I really hope for is that when we all go back to work, every show is better than it was, you know. And I think it can be if you're spending the time to learn and tune into our thing and tune into all the other stuff that's going on. So,
yeah.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. We appreciate it. Take care. We'll see you on the next one.
See you, everybody.